Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe Emet. And joining me are my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School, Long Island, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Anshe Chesed in New York City. We are talking about Parasha Vayera 5782. There's absolutely nothing going on in this Parsha. There's too much. I'm getting a new t-shirt this year. It's an amazing Parsha with so much to talk about. And we are so grateful you are joining us. Let's get right into it. The Parsha begins with Avram recovery. He's in recovery. Recovery from what, Barry?
From Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision. Abraham, blessed with, I guess, great strength, circumcises not only himself at the age
of 99,
but all the males of his household, including his 13-year-old son. What?
You just faded out there, but it's going.
Including his 13-year-old son Ishmael. And as I actually know, my college roommate converted to Judaism and had to be circumcised. And the third day is the roughest.
The third day is the roughest.
And we don't want to get into polemics about circumcision, although I think we're all really in favor. It just so happens that every time, every year at this time of the year, all of the anti-circumcision activists, the intactivists, get active. That's what they're called, intactivists. Okay, but we love all our listeners, and we want to make sure everybody. We're moving on here. Okay.
So have you ever been with? I've been 4 times for with a conversion candidate for a
circumcision
for a full adult male circumcision.
I've been once or twice. It's serious business.
It's a commitment.
It's a commitment. Okay. Well,
One guy said to me is we were talking about the fact that Orthodox authorities don't necessarily accept non-Orthodox. He says this is a commitment here.
Commitment. Okay, so speaking of commitment, we have this beautiful scene of the 3 messengers, the Malachim, coming. They are visiting. Abraham is in total hospitality mode, from which we get the whole directive of Gadol Hachnasat Orchim Mikabalat Pnei Ashchina. It's greater to receive guests than it is to receive the divine presence.
Right. Except that's kind of a loaded statement, because one reading of the text, of course, is that in fact the messengers are the divine presence.
Okay.
So it's exactly the same thing then. It's worth mentioning James Kogel wrote a book in which he talked about how confusing it often is to distinguish human beings from God in the Bible. And this is one of those scenes. First they're addressed in the plural, and then all of a sudden Abraham switches to the singular.
So this is a very, very complicated text, and we want to talk about how to read the text in a second, but if we just kind of move past the extraordinary scene of the hospitality and the receiving of this information and Sarah laughing and all that, and we have the moment where the angels, messengers leave, or they're about to go on to their journey, and then we get a switch to the next item in this Parsha, which is God disclosing his will to Avram. It's chapter 18, verse 17 and on. God says, "V'Adonai amar ha'machaseh ani me'Avraham asher ani oseh." What an extraordinary verse! It's an amazing verse. It's should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And I find that so ironic, because God has basically up until now hidden almost everything from Abraham. Hid the destination, he hid the reason, but now he's going to disclose what he's going to do. And then when ensues is the indictment of Sodom, and he says, "Zakat Sodom v'Amorah ki rabah v'chatatam ki chavda ma'od." I'm going now. The cry of Sodom and Amorah are great. Their sin is very heavy. I will go down and see what see what their scream is. If it's so, it will be destruction. If not, I will know. And it's at that point the text says, "Vayifnu misham ha'anashim vayilchu Sodoma." The angels leave and they go to Sodom, And these 5 words, Avraham odeno omeid lifnei Adonai. Abraham stands before God. Okay, so I want to say, if I was directing this play here, I would. God. You can't represent God in a human form, but it's Abraham's alone on the stage, and there's a voice, and there's a pillar of light on the stage, and this is drama. This is absolutely amazing. I would say this is what makes the Torah great storytelling, and I don't know if you have do you feel set up for what's going to be the greatest showdown here? Jeremy, I wanted you to take it up from here, which is the what's going to happen from this moment.
Well,
In this relationship, this is a moment of conflict.
it certainly is. Vayigash Avraham, and Abraham draws near, and as the Talmud actually says about this as the model for Abraham is the one who invented the Amidah Shacharit, that there is a kind of assault, that Abraham, as it were, kind of assaults God with this claim.
Is it a court?
The assault comes later with Mrs. Lote.
Mrs. Lote. No, this is the prosecutor is approaching the bench.
Well, it's funny you said about the stage directions, and Abraham remains standing before God. The Malachim go off towards Sodom, and Abraham remains standing before God. So the one way of looking at this is that Abraham is sticking his nose into this business, and he's not leaving the office. The boss says, like, don't let the door hit you in the tuchus on your way out, but he's not leaving. Okay, yeah. But what's interesting is one of the fascinating rabbinic interpretive claims is that there were a number of places where there were tikkunei sofrim, where the sages changed the Torah, edited it. What exactly does it mean? Do the sages who say this really mean that God gave them a Torah and then they amended it? But the claim in that particular rabbinic teaching is that the real text, the original text before this, said the Malachim vayifnu misham ha'anashim vayelchu Sodoma va'Adonai odenu omed lifnei Abraham, while God remained before Abraham. But they thought that was not nice to say that the divine presence would wait on a human being, so they turned it around. And by turning it around, what we have now in Abraham is sticking his nose in there and says, "Excuse me, this conversation is not over yet." His boldness is a deep thing, and I read this whole passage back and forth as the human being extremely exercised, extremely upset, making profound claims of the divine, and the divine going, "All right, buddy, you just keep talking here, and we'll see where this goes," because God knows how many people are left in Sodom who are worthy, and Abraham is doing his best to find out who is still righteous. But God already knows, I think, the end of the story. There's a kind of like a knowing, little maybe smirk, so to speak, on the divine face.
I have a slightly different read, but Barry, I want you to bring you in here.
Yeah, I have a question. You made a fascinating image with Abraham alone on stage with the pillar of light. Well, what about right before that, when the messengers are there, we're about to leave? Do you have 2 men on the stage or 3? So, and how do you portray God when Abraham? And I think this really is what sets the Torah apart, is because we have all sorts of inconsistencies, for lack of a better word, of transition. Like, it's hard, it's sort of like a biblical version of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where when you attempt to measure something, you change what you're measuring. And
well, so I would be as liberal as possible in my staging of this, just for the dramatic purposes of the power of this text is in its the way it conjures the imagination, and I think Jeremy, you and I are slightly different in the way that we interpret imaginatively what's going on, because I'll just in your interpretation, what God is like saying, leave it, and I want to give a different reading. When God says lo ashchit im emtsa sham 45 and goes down lo ashchit ba'avur shloshim lo eseh bavura arba'im lo eseh imsa shlosha lo ashchit bavura esrim. I won't destroy.
Those are the numbers in English, so people
Oh
can
yeah, I'm
know.
going to say so. It goes down from 50 to 45 to 40 to 30 to 20 to 10, and God's language is, I'm not going to do it for 30. I'm not going to do it if they're 20. I'm not going to do it if they're 10. And I'm reading into it a certain kind of pathos, which is, I'm going to do it because I know what's in there. And it really, really pains me to have to do it. After all, I've made a commitment not to do this. And here there's just nothing redeemable about this city. End of story. And
Okay, I have to insert something here. So I read this a little bit differently because I think the key moment is with Lot's kind of misplaced hospitality. That when the locals come to assault Lot and they can't assault his daughters, that's when the decision is made to destroy the city. That up until now, the choice is there. When God says, I will go down to see whether or not they are beyond redemption, I think that's still an open question.
okay.
I think that's I like that almost more. I like that almost more on a religious note than on a textual note. As I said, I'm reading this because what I think happens narratively is that Abraham says, 50 people, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And what happens in the end is that God takes out, at least gives an opportunity for 7 people, I think. Lot misses Lot,
The
2 daughters and two sons-in-law. That's 6 people.
And 2 single daughters. It's 2 married daughters with the sons-in-law and 2 single daughters that will father or mother Moab and Ammon.
Moab and Ammon. But I think the sons-in-law are either the engaged sons for the 2 single daughters or the older daughters with their husbands. But in any event, God takes out a number smaller than a minyan, which I think is the plan all along. But I do like it, if not on I don't really like it on a textual level, what you said so much, but I love it on the religious level because it conforms also to Jonah and Nineveh. And this is the God that I think, is presented overall in the Hebrew Bible, which is an ever open door to Shuvah. So Sodom, they're a mess. They're terrible. They're absolutely awful. I have to destroy the city as a whole. But if it were to be the case that Jonah were to show up in Sodom and say, Od 40 yom uSodom nehepachet, then I think there would have been a different outcome.
Absolutely, no question. And this tells us that there's a trajectory in the development of Jewish religious thinking, even in the Bible itself, that the notion of teshuvah is not yet fully formed here. We're really early on in all of these stories, and I mean, I think it's a very there's a lot of pain in this story. Of course, there's got to be a lot of pain. I mean, Lot loses, the city is destroyed. Lot is a survivor. The wife, it turns into a pillar of salt, and then of course we end up in a cave. He is almost an inverted picture of Noah, because Noah, goes on the boat with his 3 sons. Here, Lot is in a cave with his 2 daughters. The 2 daughters, I'm going to be very charitable here and say, that they see themselves as the only the human survivors of civilization, and they want to propagate the species, and so they get Lot drunk and sleep with him, become pregnant, and have 2 children. Go ahead, Barry.
Well, people go to extraordinary lengths to populate the species. I don't know if you've ever read God's Grace by Bernard Malamud, but it's well worth reading. It was his last book. I don't want to give away the kunst, but when people are in such an extreme situation, they will do almost anything, and one might think almost anything is called for in those situations.
Are you sympathetic to them, or are you, critical of them?
Well, I think both. I mean, I think we have to be sympathetic because I think that, one of the things that makes the Torah is the human element. That at all times we see humanity as expanded group, but also as individuals. I think that's part of the appeal, is that we ultimately we see ourselves and we have these conflicts within ourselves. We've all been tested or thought that extraordinary measures, however we define them, are needed. And we always wonder whether we'll measure up when we think they're called for or not.
Okay, so we move past this. These are very, very difficult stories.
I mean, they really, because they are. I mean, I do think that the Lot and the daughter's story is a kind of a dirty joke about the rival peoples, and it doesn't. It's just, and at some levels, having fun, but it is like a profoundly disturbing story of, because like parent-child incest is like the worst thing that you can imagine, and it is remarkable that in this world that we live in the 21st century, in which people are hyper aware, we've coming to a greater awareness of the way that alcohol and drugs and family dynamics and all this stuff can turn into outrageous, egregious behavior. It's rather amazing that this story actually has all of those very modern sounding elements. And it's worth pointing out just real quick before we go on that the midrash, like Lot does this on 2 successive nights. He gets so blind drunk that the daughters can have sex with him. The midrash in Breshit Rabbah says, it says though the Torah says he did not know when she lay down or when she rose, but the Torah, even still today in our modern Torahs, or maybe it's not, there's a dot over the word when she rose, and the rabbis say it means that he did not know when she lay down, but he did know when she got up, which means that like he recognized that they had sex, and the next night he got just as blind drunk. So the guilt or responsibility that aligns on Lot himself is like, the midrash there in Breshit Rabbah is given some critical attention to Lot's motives.
Right, that's verse 33, chapter 19. And the dot is there, right? Velo yada b'shichva uvekuma, and the dot is on the vav of uvkuma. Didn't know in its lying down and in her getting up. Okay, so very, very difficult story. And we have another episode of the wife-sister motif where they are now in the Negev. Abraham and Sarah, they go and they're visiting with Avimelech. Abraham says, "Tell him you're my sister," and that happens again. I don't want to go into it. We go into the next story here, which is the birth of Isaac. Profound moment. Of course, it's still familiar to us because we read it on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Vadonai pakad et Sarah. God remembered Sarah. Let's get into this theme now of how we're reading these stories and how does the Torah want us to read, and how do we read, and how do we relate to these individuals and their lives here? Look what we have in this story. We have Abraham, we have Sarah, we have the birth of a child, we have Hagar, the other woman, the co-wife, we have Ishmael. What is the Torah asking us here, and how are we reading? And set us up for the next story also, because that's going to make more demands on us. Jeremy, these are not easy questions.
No, not at all easy. And here we have they're not easy because we read these stories, so to speak, about, Akedat Yitzchak, the Akedat Ishmael, the binding of Isaac, and then so to speak, the binding of Ishmael being banished into the desert. Abraham is the founder of this nation. When you come to the Torah, talking about Abraham Avinu, who in Kabbalistic mythology is like, whenever you seek the character Abraham in the Torah, it is a stand-in or a symbol of, or a living symbol of divine mercy, and there is not mercy. This is the father who like when Sarah says we got to throw this kid into the desert, he doesn't like it, but he doesn't stop it either. And when God says, God said to Abraham, "Kill me a son," as Bob Dylan said, he says, "Okay." And there's a lot that one has to deal with on a human level as you read these stories. I think that the great mythologies of the world of which our Holy Torah is, has some resemblances. They're not, to me, describing events that happen. They're describing profound, heavily freighted symbolic situations in which people have to respond to impossible demands. People have to have faith when everything in their world seems to be crushing down, and they have to gather up the strength to live with faith, and they have to have this sense of trust, and they have to walk through these incredible ordeals. Abraham is a character who endures ordeals, and they are such an incredibly literary, intense. The story of the Akedah is so short but so packed with you can really feel the slow steps of Abraham up the mountain with Isaac, and Isaac says, "Where's the lamb?" And Abraham says, "God will see the lamb."
Warma.
And then they walked on together. I mean, that is the literary power of that is amazing. So what I think the text is asking us, especially in the story of the Akedah, to wrestle with is, can you continue following what you take to be a spiritual demand, even when that demand would mean the end of your progeny? The whole thing was about Abraham's going to have children. Now you might be called upon to end that. And how do you listen to a divine demand that asks you to do the unthinkable, and somehow you just continue to walk that path?
Barry, I don't know if you have a go ahead.
Yeah, I was struck by your note about Abraham having no mercy for Ishmael and Isaac. And I wonder if that is not designed to provide a comment on the ostensible mercy that he has for the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19, when he's arguing or talking with God. Because I think the way we often read it is that Abraham is concerned that the innocent not be swept away with the guilty. He knows his family. I think he knows that they're not entirely innocent. And so perhaps we're willing to say about Abraham there that he's a universalist. But the problem, I think, is that sometimes people who are universalists don't really care all that much about their own families. And maybe that's Abraham at the Akedah and with the banishment of Ishmael.
So I mean, when you bring that up, it just illustrates. It just illustrates one of the challenges in reading the text, which is, what does the text mean? What does the text want us to ask? What kinds of questions does the text want us to ask? And I think
so.
It's almost limitless. Okay, go ahead.
It is. And what I'd like to add is that we read the Torah on at least two different levels. What we're doing now, we're talking about the Parsha. We're supposed to read the Parsha every week. Actually, we're supposed to read it twice in the Targum as well. And you might ask, why do we have to read it every week? We read it last year. Well, we change. The Torah is a kind of measuring stick. And by reading it Parsha by Parsha, we slow it down, and it invites us to connect the Torah to whatever is going on in our life. But the books of the Torah were written probably as actual books, meaning that Sefer Bereshit was probably designed in its final rendering as a complete book with a beginning and an end. The same with Shemot, Vayikra, etc. And we lose something when we don't ever read them as.
Okay.
What makes the Torah limitless is that we change every week. And if not every week, certainly year to year.
Look, we might even change in the same week. I start reading the Parsha, preparing for class, on Monday. And by Friday, I have one class on Monday. I think, oh, what a great lesson. I can use it on Shabbos. And by Friday, I'm in a totally different place on this. And I want to say that
one thing about that, which is, I have to say about our jobs, is I think this is true about the Jewish people, especially if you, as Barry said, read, Shtai Mikra Chad Targum, and you read the story twice in the Bible text and at least once with the commentary. That would always be true, but it's kind of good that we have the job that we have, because we got to read the Parsha every week, and it really is. It just is such a blessing in my life that the Torah is like it. That's how I mark time.
Absolutely. And so let's go to the Akedah now, which is the last story in this Parsha, which demands a total attention from the reader. And I think that's what you mentioned, before, Jeremy, which is in remarking on the way that the text tells the story, it is saying to you, you need to notice every single sound here, every single silence here. You need to notice every word, every letter of every word. You need to know where the pauses are taking place, what the distance is. And I think the text is demanding us, and here I'm going to add the strategy that we have to be there with them. I use theatrical terms, both here and teaching this, and say, we're both on the stage and we're in the audience. We're watching and we want to say to Avraham, don't do it, but we can't. It's a great Star Trek thing. We want to influence the histories in some way, but it has to be this way. The way the Torah tells the story is that the angel stops him from so read that verse. The verse is in the middle of chapter 22, by verse 10. Vayishlach Avraham et yado. He sends his hand, and vayishlach, whatever that means, to send your hand. Vayikach et hamachel lishchot et beno. So I'm going to ask you the question. If you are staging this, where the next verse is verse 11. Vayikra elav malach Adonai. So I'm Abraham, and let this be the knife, okay? Is the angel stopping me here, or here, right?
None of the above.
None of the above.
None of the above, because as we know, maybe our readers, our listeners know this as well. There is a long tradition, midrashic tradition, that a great seminary professor Shalom Spiegel collected in Hebrew essay called Me'agadot HaAkedah, from the legends of the Akedah, and then was published in English as a book called The Last Trial, that it's not the story of disaster narrowly averted, it's the story of the death and then the resurrection of Isaac, that there's plenty of midrashim to this effect. Obviously, that is the midrash of Christianity. The beloved child is killed and resurrected, but also the Haftarah, the child that Elisha announces to the Shunammite woman, that child also dies and Elisha brings him back to life. I think midrashically he's supposed to be Yonah ben Amittai, that child will become the prophet Jonah. And I think the story, I think that the Torah's rendering that says that it did not happen, I mean, that is the pshat of the Torah, that God stopped it from happening. But I think that so for me, one of the ways in which this is true is that Abraham is called upon to go through with the totally unthinkable, and not ultimately doesn't have to do it, actually perhaps does it. And the child is resurrected. So then this becomes a story about going right up to the gates of hell, if necessary, and then coming back to life. Because this religion does care a lot about the resurrection of the dead. Tchiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead, is a big part of this religion. So one way, not the only way to read the story, but you asked, like, how would I stage it? I'd kind of like to go with that midrashic tradition, that it's like you go to hell and come back out.
Barry?
I love the midrash that Spiegel writes about in The Last Trial, and I think that there's a lot of power to it. But I think that for me, a lot of times I think about how crushingly disappointed Abraham is when he has to stop. Because once you commit yourself to a course of action like that, you need to complete it to have a sense of completion. And being stopped in the middle is, in a sense, worse than actually doing it, even as horrific as the act itself is. Elliot, you're shaking your head. I can't imagine why.
I disagree with both of you as usual. Can't get over it. I'm so inclined to the pshat reading of this text, where he doesn't. I'm living in the moment. I'm watching this happen, and I'm seeing the hesitation, and the Abraham that I want to have here is an Abraham that absolutely does not want to do this, and wants to do this, wants to use every ounce of hesitation because he said God will show us the lamb for the offering, and he really believes it, right? That he will not have to do this, and that the sense of this text is here, the limit to which I am going to go to serve God will affect my child, and the darkest reading I could give to this, which is just one step short of God, he kills him. The second darkest reading is he will allow himself to put his child through this because that's what's being asked for.
But that is interesting. What's the second darkest reading? Is my reading darker or not? The
Kill this child.
Well, because of the trauma, like I said, I find that the Torah's power is from the intensities of the situations, not the individual characters. Maybe I said that before we started recording. But the trauma that is foisted upon Yitzhak, that the parent is doing this, is just mind-blowing. Why is it that those midrashic traditions that I said, why is it that they took root? They responded to something, anything that lasted in Judaism over all these many centuries of transmitting texts orally and in writing to a small group of literate people. The stories like made it because they responded to something that people were thinking or needed to hear.
But there's also an anti-Christian polemic going on in those interpretations. Let's be honest. But
no, I don't think that's quite right. Well, whatever. But here's the thing that I do think is is relevant. That traumatic element is really just so intense. But I want to tell you this real quick. There's a early modern thinker called Yashar Mikandia, also named Yosef Shlomo Domenico, who actually, it's known that Spinoza had his book. The book was published in Amsterdam in the early 17th century, and Spinoza had it. And Yashar Mikandia writes the most amazing interpretation. This is an early modern guy. And he said, it's not that an angel stopped him. It's that Abraham saw the ram caught in the thorns and thought better of it. So here you had this early modern guy who wanted to turn the knob down on divine intervention and said that Abraham got a better idea. And I just think that's an amazing teaching about how, because modern people, I think, are appropriately should be, if you heard Hashem telling you to go kill your child, you would need some serious antipsychotic medication. And in that interpretation, Yosef Shlomo Domenico is kind of saying, Abraham got back in his right mind when he came up with a better idea. I really like that interpretation.
Okay, I think we have to then focus on something that we have not focused on yet, and that is that God makes the command originally, but it's the angel that stays Abraham's hand. And I'm thinking that the reason why the malach has to stay Abraham's hand is because the voice isn't enough. He has to be physically restrained. And the malach is a human incarnation of God in some way. That, in other words, Abraham does not stop because the angel says stop. Abraham stops because the angel grabs him and prevents him from killing his son.
Okay, so that's nowhere in the text. Sorry, okay?
Then you're reading the wrong version.
Right? Yeah. Al tishlach et yad.
Abraham.
Yeah. Al tishlach yadcha al anar. Don't.
Why is it? No,
it's always in the paintings. You're looking at paintings.
No.
Think about why is it the malach and not God?
And Barry's got something on it. Barry's got something. First of all, you're reading with Rashi.
Yes.
Al tishlach yadcha al anar is one. Al taslo me'umah is two, because Abraham is saying, all right, can I at least stab him a little bit? That's Rashi's interpretation. So I think that you've got something.
Right. Look, he's talking. Your question still stands, Barry, which is why isn't it God Himself? And I think something happened here on the way to the Akedah, which is God doesn't really talk to Abraham again, and I think that this is part of the story, which is the relationship gets ruptured. The relationship between Abraham and Isaac is ruptured. They don't talk again. The relationship between God and Abraham gets ruptured. It's unbearably painful. And that's why I say the dark reading of it is not that he kills him, is that everything that has been moving in this story is moving to this point, and we don't have any resolution here. Do you know what we have next week?
But if we don't have resolution, then we have to ask is what makes this Torah? In other words, if we take your reading, then what are we supposed to take away from this?
We're
So
supposed to
this is really intense because and it ties also to the Haftarah, and it ties also to the birth of Yishmael. What are we supposed to take away from it? How is it Torah without resolution? Well, one of the things is, and this maybe also ties to circumcision, because one of the things is that you have this child, and you love this child more than you have power to protect this child. I mean, this is my experience.
It's a human condition.
That's the human condition. You have infinite love and finite power. And part of it is one of the reasons this story works so intensely, and maybe even Lot and the daughters, maybe this is in there. The knowledge that you have this beautiful baby boy, and you're going to cut it when it's 8 days old. And so I think that one of the ways that we inflict pain on those we love, and they don't belong to us, and we cannot always keep them safe, and sometimes we lose them. And so I think the story works on one of the levels on which the story works is that agonizing, as Elliot said correctly, just unbearably painful space in which a parent is told to take a child and maybe lose the child.
All right, so this is the takeaway that we're running out of time, which is I agree with what you said. It's demanding of us to ask ourselves, what does the commitment to God and what does the commitment to this life mean? And you cannot protect your children from everything. And this is the exact moment that we find ourselves in the culture. We want to protect everybody, and we just can't. There's terror out there. There is the life of faith is demanding. It's not leisure. It's not entertainment. And what Abraham is being asked is to go through this a traumatic experience, an impossible experience where there is no right answer, and to somehow emerge on the other side. And he does it because he does not withhold his son. Doesn't mean he was willing to sacrifice. It means he did not withhold his protection. He rescinded his protection of his son at that time. V'lo chasachta means he enabled his son to be vulnerable to the trauma at that time, which is a horrible thing to demand, and that's what's being demanded here.
You want it darker?
I want it so dark.
You want it darker. I just want to make it. First of all, the Spiegel Midrashim, for those who are listening, maybe have not read it, is that they are about the medieval crusade narratives in which Jews actually, and we can, his professional historians will debate whether or not this actually happened or is just a rhetorical trope. But the Crusader narratives say that Jews killed their own children al kiddush Hashem in martyrdom rather than turn them over to the Crusader mobs.
Yeah.
And in it says, the imagined Chana. There's an imagined Chana from the Hanukkah period in which she says, Abraham, you got nothing. You sacrifice one children, I sacrifice 7. And I just, I've spoken to people, I'm sure you guys have all spoken to people, who've carried their children into surgeries, and our Israeli brothers and sisters, none of us have sent our sons off to Tzahal.
Right.
But can you imagine what is it like, Israeli parents, it's it's not a remote possibility that they're really sending their children off and exposing them.
Those scenes of the parents standing at the bus stop with, putting their kids on the buses and they're weeping. Some are, they're embracing their kids with pride, and some they're weeping. And you know what? I mean, we have a fraction of them. I mean, you put a kid on a plane, right, to go to Israel this year. I've put on your kids on planes before, right? What happens when they go through security? What do you do? Right?
Oh my God!
And so I walk back from the terminal. I go like, are we the only people in the world that do this to our children? We send them off. We're not the only people, of course. But we send them off to to the unknown. I mean, we're also over time, but I have to put this in because, you know, our kids go on these trips to Europe, right? Your kids go to on March of the Living tours. My kids went on for their high school, and so, you know, you step away. You know, it's important. They see the history, etc., and then you step back and say, what are we doing? Why are we subjecting our children to marinate in and to see this at the age of 16? I couldn't go until I was over 40 years old, you know, to see what this is. This is, and so we're saying, yeah, you don't withhold this from your children, and that's what makes. So when I ask the question of how do we read it because our lives depend on it. Our lives are on the line here. It
And next week, our lives will depend on something else because we'll have a new Parsha.
We have a new Parsha.
And we will take it seriously.
And we'll take it seriously. Well, we thank you for watching our emotion here.
All right, everybody.
We appreciate
All right,
it.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.